Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the class of Quranic Studies. And this is our seventh week, and we are ready to go. As most of you, probably all of you know, the topic of this week is creation, universe, and man. Um, so it's a topic, maybe very interesting topic, and not only in our discussion. I mean, it's not a question only when we discuss about a religion like Islam, but not only all the religions and tradition, but also in the modern science as well. It's important. So that's why we do have NASA, for instance, and many other, centers trying to figure out how creation or how the universe started and began. So our discussion is going to somehow um, pay attention to the matter of creation in a religious context, which is Islam, and to discuss the manner in which Quran talks about creation. For for this end, I would like to refer to a verse of Quran, which really is very important. One of the very important verses we that talk about the universe, that talk about creation, has always been important and importantly focused and pointed to in all scriptures and traditions. But as we are talking about Quran, I definitely go to look at the Quran, but oh, it's also good to pay attention to to one question or one point. Let's talk about religions and traditions at all. I mean, the old traditions. Uh, how they were talking about the beginning, you know, because again, in the tradition, you do have the idea of the beginning and the end, which are the two very important points in every religious discussion or every serious philosophical discussion, at least in the classic and post-classic world, unless you're not talking about the end in modern philosophy. Sometimes, philosophy had its own very um, different classification during the modern time, like a philosophy of language, philosophy. But mostly, when philosopher in like a pre-Socrates, post-Socrates, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, era, when they were talking about, when they were philosophizing, one of the most important questions that they were dealing with was the question of the beginning and the end. Now, as I mentioned, we are looking to the Quran, but nevertheless, why not talking about Rig Veda, in which the story and the tale of the beginning starts with, and I'm quoting, "One alone is the down beaming over all things. It is the one that severe that severally becomes all things." So that one thing becomes all thing, and one alone is the down beaming over all this. So the Rig Veda brings us the idea of one. And let's go to Tao by Tao Te Ching, chapter 1, and very famously, probably many of you have heard this. The nameless Tao. I mean, the nameless. It doesn't talk even about Tao, but the nameless is the beginning of the heaven and earth. The named Tao, again, this is interpretation, is the mother of 10,000 things. So there's a nameless and there's a named in Tao, in Teshing or Teching, which is also you do probably find about is with our discussion about the Islamic God having essence and attributes and names, and then you were talking about the essence of God in a way that you say that no, the essence of God is a sort of uh, unknowable. You cannot know it. It's kind of ambiguously or beyond your understanding or whatever. That beyond understanding, that unknowingness of that essence of God here in teaching as becoming like, in fact, the nameless. And then that's nameless is the beginning of the heaven and earth. Heaven here is probably, most probably, the sort of pre-creation of human, or pre-fall probably, or pre-creation of this universe. And then earth means that the universe in the way that you and I, we can see it. It's a visible whole universe. Anyway, and then let's go to Gospel of John, in which the discussion starts, the chapter starts, and the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see, in the beginning was the Word. So the Word, and then you will have the interpretation of the Word as, like blood and flesh, the Word become blood and flesh, or whatever. But the more philosophically talking about this, the Word is with the God. The Word was with God. I mean, actually, the question is that whether talking about God, that when we talk about a concept of God, which is beyond time and beyond space, then you may ask, well, can I talk about him in the past tense, or is he always in the present tense? Let's say that in the beginning is the Word, and the Word is with God, and the Word was God, is God. So the Word is God. Now, let's look at the Quran. Now, we focus, narrow all those things into the discussion of Quran, because we are discussing about the Quran now. Let's read chapter 36, verse 81, in which you will find that God says, and to Muhammad, or probably to the addresses to the people who read this book. But now, let's see what Quran suggests us. As mentioned, the issue of word in the Bible, and in the Gospel of John is important. So it's a beginning. It's finally the same thing. I mean, is with God and is God now. So, as mentioned, Quran chapter 36, verse 81 talks about creation or beginning, which was the question. So, but his command, when he intend a thing, is only that he says unto it, be, and it is. The issue is that when Muslim scholars discuss about creation, This is be, which is in Arabic kun. So the verse reads as the following. So, by his command, so we have the idea of command here, command of God, he, when he intend a thing, is only that he says unto it, be, and it is. So there are some, discussions here. First of all, there's a command of God. He commands something, and his command only is one word, nothing more than that. There's no action, no practice, nothing, no need to anything else, any like material to make something out of that very essence, very material. So here is the discussion is that one, he commands by his word. Do you remember that we did look at the Gospel of John, where he talks about in the beginning was a word, and the word is word of God and the breath of the merciful. So that's the breath of merciful in this case, as Ibn Arabi puts, one of the very famous Muslim mystics. He says that it's the breath of the all merciful that becomes word, then becomes universe, and becomes creation. Now, well, when we talk about Quran and the very issue of the beginning or the start or the beginning of the universe, it's a it says it's a word, it's a saying, it's a something, and there's nothing else. But philosophically speaking, when you talk to something, you probably have it in your mind or in your knowledge. Imagine that God, in God's knowledge, all these things are existing. In God's knowledge, you have all creation, you have all everything. And I'm intentionally talking about this point to go to my other other part of discussion, because the point is that one, there's order, there's a command, and then there's nothing else. I mean, there's no material based on which you are, I mean, making another thing. I mean, it's only command, okay, but you are probably, if we human, we wanted to imagine this, we are having the imagination, and in our in our mind, we do have something, and then we say to it that okay, be, and then it's there. You don't need to do anything in the action. Okay, so if this is the case, and as mentioned, and if the saying or the word is there, which is, then you will find it common between like Christianity, Islam, and then that one of Tao or Rig Veda, the nameless becomes named. And so the point is that the word, and this is the word, this is the word of God that someone like Ibn Arabi puts it as the breath of all merciful. So that's the breath of all merciful that comes out and becomes word and becomes the universe and becomes everything else. Now, so that's why, I mean, in parentheses, let me tell you something. Maybe it's not bad to refer to the idea that some philosophers and mystics, in trying to say, in explaining the creation by God, they do use the word emanation instead of creation. The word emanates from God, that word of God, it flows from him. It's as breath of all merciful. Anyway, in this way, God creates and begins. Now, I said There's nothing else. And as I said, there's only a command, and it must be there. And it is. And it is. Now, specifically going to our discussion about the creation and about the very issue that I mentioned, that imagine that you have it in your mind, you have a set of things in your mind, and then you order it, and then it's there. The very philosophical question begins whether you who are creating have the foreknowledge, you're omniscient of all these things, or you're not. How can you imagine that you do not know everything in your mind? Then you are perfectly going to say to it to be, and it is. So let's go and look at the history of Islamic tradition, history of Islamic uh, history of Quranic commentary, and see what happened in the history when the discussion of creation, was debated, and people encountered with this very important question, which is kind of very existential question, probably at one also as well. It creates many discussions, not only in Islamic, it's created not only in Islamic tradition and history, but in all religious tradition, it created many discussions and questions, and probably disputations. Now, there's chapter 54, which is called chapter Al-Qamar, the moon, and there's a talk. So this as the chapter moon discusses about, at one point, as I mentioned toward the end, discusses the question of creation. I'm sorry, question of the end of the time, and as we mentioned earlier, it's sometimes also Quran. Sometimes when it refers to the day of judgment or to the end of the time, it calls it the hour, or asa in Arabic language. Now it says that there's a discussion in the Quran. Quran talks about the hour is coming. So, yes. So this is one of the basic discussions in the Quran. Hour is coming. Now, indeed, and then it discusses about the unbelievers and those who dispute with Muhammad about the hour, about they don't believe it, they don't think that it's real and it's coming. They discuss it in other chapters of Quran. You will see the nature of these discussions, the debate, that they say that no, how come you when you become dust, how come, or who can give you life or make you alive again? So there's a discussion, but Quran says that they will face hellfire if they do not believe. And after discussing with you with all those kind of proofs that you provide for them, they still insist on their polytheistic ideas, then they will face the hellfire, which is the end of polytheism and the Quranic tradition or any religion. So now, but at the end of this discussion, or at the end of this kind of a story, there's a small verse which kind of created huge discussions, really, along with many other verses. But this kind of a key verse here makes that Indeed, we have created everything in a measure. Okay. Chapter 54, uh, verse 49, God says, and indeed, we have created everything in a measure. Now, we discussed that God is a creator in religious term, and then he discussed, so he creates everything, and then in a measure. So measure is a discussion here. In a measure in Arabic, there's a word uh, applied for this is the word qadar. إنا خلقنا كل شيء بقدر. So basically, I will talk about why this may create huge discussions and debates, and what are those debates. So shortly, we will discuss those things regarding the issue of. So as mentioned, we were discussing about the issue of creation, and then the issue of um, how God creates the universe and man. So the word of God, we said that the nameless and named one, and we said that the God whose word is the essential component, or the the very real thing about creation itself. Now, when we look at the chapter Al-Qamar, or the chapter Moon, and the Quran, the discussion comes that when God says that when we create everything, or when we create everything in measure. So, what's the measure? Why it becomes so important in the history of Islamic thought, or what is its equivalent in like a religion like Christianity and Judaism, for instance. However, there are some trying to say that, and especially in one of the scholars, early scholars of Islam, Maqatil, who died in 767, the early period of Islam, it says that the earliest people, those who were living in the time around Prophet himself, uh, this did not indicate for them any concern with theological issue of divine predestination. Now, so the word qadar means predestination in a way. I mean, that's one of the meaning. So what this suggests that this controversial topic will only just began with the later middle of the second Islamic century. It became an issue. It became a discussion, and it probably rendered, translated into something that, well, there's a predestination, there's a foreknowledge of God, and whatever you do, it's probably God wanted so and so, and you are doing so and so. Now the question is, if it is like this, then why God has to punish anyone, or why he should reward anyone for their deeds? And why is he asking people to face to something, or obey or disobey something? All these questions creating like discussions, disputations, movements that we will touch and discuss a little bit about those in minutes to come. Now, going to qadr, measuring out and going to imagine if uh, it wasn't at very early Islam a question and concern that really got, uh, sort of predestined his knowledge. He has foreknowledge, and then whatever you do, he it's beforehand, and then whatever also you do is his will, as a qadar, because he planned everything, and then it's going to according to plan. How can you solve the problem with your idea of free will? I have free will, or I don't have free will. Do we have free will? Now, let me ask you a question. If I ask you to stand up and to stand on one of your feet, then you will be easily able to choose to do so. But if I ask you to take both your foot off, you can't do this. In the early example, you are able to, you are able to choose between doing this or not doing, You do this if you want, and you don't do this if you don't want. But for the second example, whether you want or not, you can't do this. Yes, you can jump, but you cannot detach yourself for a long time and stand up in normal situation without your foot touching the earth. So what's the problem? Okay, in this example, we saw something between, free will and choose, and kind of not being able to do something, whether if you want it or not. So what's the nature of determination and design, or pre-design something? What's the role of human agency here in this world? If there's knowledge of God, and so why are we talking about free will? If knowledge of God, predestination. If God knows what will happen from eternity, it must necessarily happen that way, or else his knowledge would be erroneous. God designed something, and imagine if we want to change the knowledge of God. Not knowledge of God. If we do something that is not according to his will. So this is the question. Or, if God knows what will happen from eternity, it must necessarily happen. This is the question. Necessarily happen. When something necessarily happens and should happen, is there your free will there? Are you, as a human agent, are you having free will to do so? Consequently, can someone ask you why you did so and so? If God's omniscience and consequently prescient, if he is such, if he's omniscient, and if he's omniscient, prescient, everything must be predetermined. including me and your fate as well. So this is the problem. Everything must be predetermined. So that's why the question and problem of divine foreknowledge was determining human agency, its free will, and causing social, political, cultural issues and problems. We'll discuss them. Now, what happens in the history of Islam with this kind of questions? I mean, with this sample verse of Quran, is that amazingly, commentators and scholars took the same thing for both, saying that there is free will or there is predestination. And so let's start with this, the idea of determination. The earliest determinists, they were known as Jabbariya, literally means that compulsionists. They held that all human acts were determined by God, including acts of belief, disbelief, good and evil, everything. From their perspective, that's the verse that we just mentioned, and truly we created everything, and measure supports the position that God has predetermined all events, especially when read in light of the other verse in chapter 76, verse 30, and you do not will but that God wills. Truly, God is knowing, wise. So we do not will, but God wills. So even we discuss the free will. The other verse, this two verse like discussed together, and then you have the idea of predetermination. But there is also another group they call Qadariya, those who were talking about the free will. And Qadariya also were a group of people, but mostly also started in the 2nd century of Islam, and they were disagreeing with the ideas of this first group of Jabariya. They were talking about human free will and the very notion of a human being able to decide about for himself and his agency, his human agency, the ability to decide and to act. So those who were pro, determinism, and like in Arabic, Jabr, were also using some of the hadith literature, saying that Prophet said that believing in Jabr or predetermination is one of the tenets of Islam, and whoever is not accepting it, so he's not Muslim at all. But we do also have the other group. Moreover, I mean, they were also pointing out to us some other Quranic verses, like chapter 8, verse 9, saying that, I'm quoting, God knows that which every female bears or carry, whether it will be male or female, sound or deficient, tall or short. So now there is as I mentioned, the same verse was interpreted into opposite ways. Um, so Jabbariya, those who were talking about the predetermined uh, and kind of the pre-science of God to be determined the human or whatever's life were called Jabbariya, and those who were against them and opposing them were also called Qadariya. Now we will discuss this, but I would like to repeat the fact again that according to some, um, this issue was not, according to Maqatil, was not a problem or theological problem in the early Islam, because maybe people were trying to read this through, the whole story with the verses before that, or saying that, yeah, there were those group of, people, unbelievers, then it says that, yeah, if you don't believe, you go and encounter the hellfire. And then God says that we, created everything in a measure, and that indicate that, okay, if you don't do this, then you will face that. So everything has its own consequences. Now, but returning to the measure, the Qadariya, as I mentioned, the opposite to the first group were those who mainly, as I mentioned, in the Caliphate of Hisham. These are the Umayyad caliphs. In the period shortly before 110, um, were existed, especially in Syria. The Qadaris were incorporated into a greater rational theological movement of the second or eighth and ninth centuries. Another group that were called Mu'tazilite, that sometimes we refer to them as the rationalists, or in the early Islamic history. And what was the rationalist or the uh, ideas of the Mu'tazila is that they did created a rational theology, and were insisting on complete human free will in a way that insisting that if there is if there is a hell, a life after death, and then people will be punished and will be rewarded because of their action or their belief in the sport. So there is no, it doesn't has any sense if they do punish or reward based on what they haven't choose to do so, or or obey or not obey or disobey. So it's kind of senseless. Now, again, in those Mu'tazilite, or the basically the Qatariya, they were also had another opposition. They were called Hanbalites, who were fiercely opposed to this movement. And from the fourth Islamic or 10th century onward, Muslim theology would be defined by heated debates and polemics between key figures from both sides: the traditionalists on one hand, and the Mu'tazilites on the other. So, um, and then if we go and look at the history, uh, you will find probably interesting issues. During the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the one who called himself as a caliph of Prophet of Islam, and whose Khalifa was kind of rejected and or questioned by some people, uh, saying that you are not, you're not having the uh, probably qualities for this position. And he and his supporters were supporting or basically introducing the idea that, well, Muawiyah is now the, Caliph of Prophet. It has been the will of God, and we are, predetermined. And you're supposed to follow God's will, whether you want or not. That's it. So, kind of, as I mentioned a little bit ago, that it creates or created a kind of political, social, cultural, philosophical discussions and issues, and not only in the Islamic history, but in all every other religions and traditions history. Now imagine if the king says that, well, yeah, this is the will of God, and you have to obey. There's no other way. And if you, in fact, if you say that there is a kind of tyranny, and then the king or the caliph is not, just or whatever. So you come with the idea of, okay, just let's revolt, let's make a revolution. But the point is that you will be faced with the idea that you are rejecting God's will, and that's making another problem, big problem. So you are in trouble in the society that, you, based on the Jabbariya or the determinism, God determinism. If you disagree with everything, you disagree with God, and so you have Muawiyah disagree. Muawiyah, kind of trying to say that if you are disagreeing with me or my sons Yazid, so you are disagreeing with the will of God. How can you want to solve this, theological problem? On the other hand, as I mentioned, the Qadariya or Mu'tazilites as well, they said that no, they also find out about the another verses of Quran talking about the responsibility of human being, and God asking them to, uh, uh, God asking them to use their mind, use their intellect, use their rationality to understand that, for instance, having faith is better than not having faith. Those people, um, the idea for those people was that, okay, um, there's a free will and God. I mean, it's probably nonsense to say that God uh, will question the things that you have no control or anything over that. Oh, now in the history of Islam, um, those Mu'tazilite later on and during the Caliph uh, uh, at Ma'mun, who was with them, the life in opposition with the Muawiyah and Yazid, who were supporting the idea of, supporting the idea of Jabariya or the determinism. They were supporting the, the idea of the free will, and then now the term thing changes. Those and socially, those who were Multazilite, they gained power, and then they were, forcing the idea to the others. And then again, later on, those who were Jabris, they, took power, and they were, forcing the others. So this disputation also caused social and political also consequences. Now, let's look again. We mentioned that this verse, which is that truly we have created everything according to a measure, or in Arabic, according to qadar. Qadar is measure. I mean, basically, literally, is measure. This verse can be understood as a straightforward affirmation of God's creation of all things in relation to the preceding verses, which I mentioned. It can also be understood as simple a statement that God decreed or measured a punishment for the disbelievers, as I mentioned. So, and cast them into the hellfire. But now, when you do have that tradition of prophet, it says that, well, believing in God is part of your faith, you know, he debated that. And so, it existed. I don't, so we are not talking about whether it was a sound, authentic one or not. But, when we talk about the hadiths that denying a group of people because of certain idea, and then we see that, yeah, there has been, political movements and things like that around it, then you may think, oh, what about the idea of that there are many hadiths that have been fabricated within those kind of, up and downs. Now imagine if Muhammad, um, in his debate with those who denied God's qadr or decree, this verse become a focal point for discussing the relation between divine determination and human choice. Qadr, or measuring out, is also said to be one of the tenets of faith, which are said in the Hadith literature, regarding which the Prophet said, no servant of God truly believes until he believes in Qadr. It's good and evil. Okay, so you should say that. Okay, what is Qadr? Qadr is everything you do, and then it could be good or it could be bad, and you should believe in both of them. Imagine if a king saying that, so here it is, I am the king, and you have to obey. There's no way to disobey. And so that's the evil of that, and you have to obey that one as well. And until he realizes that what has befallen him was not going to miss him, and what missed him was not going to befall him. So, this literature, whether it sounds authentic or not, existed and discussed by those who pro-determination. The earliest determinists, known as Jabbarid, as I mentioned, so held that human acts were determined by God, and it was including every kind of act that human, you know, um, um, does. But and then the point is that those Qadari, I'm sorry, Jabris, or proper predecessors, um, pro-Jabr people, determinists, was referring to another kind of verses like Also, Quran talks about what you will. It's the will of God. You don't will, but the will of God, God's will. Or you don't will, but that God wills. But truly, God is knowing wise. And then saying that with all this, considering all these verses, so which was favored the greater degree of human choice or self determination. Uh, I'm sorry, those who were preferring this kind of free will of human being, they probably prefer to focus on the manner in which God has created everything with precision or in a perfect measure. This theological debate correlates with the debate over how this verse should be read. So, so as I said, the verse reads as, "And we created everything in a measure." Everything in Arabic is kullu shay, and if it is read in the accusative kulla shay, the reading, this kind of kulla shay, which I said that it's an accusative reading, is preferred by most commentators and found in all schools of um, in all school of recitation of the Quran. But one that is more problematic from a grammatical perspective. If, however, kul shay is read in a nominative, like kullu shay, kullu shay. So the first one was kulla shay. The second one, if it is read like kullu shay, the verse could be understood to mean everything that we have created is according to a measure. So, like saying, meaning to say that so everything is perfect in its own way. This interpretation would still allow one to see the verse as a declaration of God's omnipotence, of God's omnipotence and divine determinism, especially when read in light of the phrase found in another chapter 13:16 of Quran, which says that God is the creator of all things. So, but it could also lead one to think that there might be things that God has not created that are not according to his measure. And here we can think about, so what about things that we human beings are doing? So everything that he did are good. And then you do find support for this in religious context as well. So everything is he did is fine. But everything is you do as human being may be fine, maybe not fine. So the question or the response to those who determinists is that so this verse could be read in a way that mean that yeah, God created everything in measure, in a perfect measure, and but human does things that is not in a perfect measure. So this is kind of a debate existed and really hugely discussed and disputed and caused many debates and disputations. So in the continuation of our discussion about the idea of creation and the creation of the world and universe, in fact, and man, let's go back to Razi. Razi, one of the uh, very famous, most important Quranic commentators, who was a philosopher, in fact, and so He also discusses this, the very verse that we discussed as well, that the command of God in creation is just one word, and it's be, and it is. So the command in Arabic called amr. So the amr functions as an instrument of God's creative activity. You know, also there is also, as mentioned, the discussion of that God doesn't need to have any other material to create things. It's kind of called, it creates entities ex nihilo, without anything, from nothing, and rather than out of prior material elements. Now, Razi talks about this verse based on, his philosophical idea of creation through a distinctive reading of the verse. As mentioned, and I'm quoting the verse, our command is but one word, as the twinkle of an eye. Also, in another verse, our command, uh, when we when we want something or create something, say to it be. Now, Razi says that this means that God's command is just one word. This is one, which is his word be in Arabic, kun. This is the apparent, well-known meaning. In addition to this, when God wills a thing, he says to it, be. So that here there are two things, namely his will and his speech or word, qawl in Arabic. His will is his foreknowledge, qadar, and his word is his decree, qada. His word, one, carries out two matters. He says that our command is but one word. So why one? So Razi want to discuss this. He says that one carries out two matters. The first is the clarification that there is no need for him to repeat his word. No. And this is an allusion to the execution of the command. The second is the clarification of the absence of the differences of the state, so that his command, in view of the creation of the greater throne, is like his command in view of the creation of a tiny ant. So rather, his command with the whole is one. So it doesn't say that B, 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 B. So it's all at once. God's words, as the twinkling of an eye, is a comparison to creation count, not a comparison to his command or amr. For it is as though he said, our command is one, so that which received which receives the command comes into being in the twinkling of an eye, since if it were to refer to the command, that would not be an attribute of price appropriate for him. The word be is also a thing which he makes exist as the twinkle of an eye. So the discussion, Razi's discussion is, as we saw, it's kind of philosophical discussion, and God generates contingent thing. Uh, God, and then he elaborates this based on his referring to our command is one word. He proposes that that the Quranic term command, amr, denotes a single word, which is God's decree, be. Moreover, he maintains that God generates entities within the domain of his command, namely the celestial intellects and entities without without dimensions, by uttering his decree, be. So that's the creation. I mean, it's kind of philosophical. Razi tries to um, include or sort of bring his the philosophical notion and idea of creation into the Quranic uh, verse, and then try to say that whatever is said in the philosophy, especially the Greek philosophy, and in continuation of it in the Islamic philosophy, is also matches with what Quran talks about creation. So one of the other things which we need to know about the Quranic idea of creation as well, or the God's act in relation to this creation, is Qaza and Qadar. So we mentioned Qadar is like a pre-knowledge of him, but and Qadar is the decree that comes out of that. So we discuss later on with another part of the topic on creation, universe, and man.